Very much, Alastair. You're all very welcome to this morning's session on job creation and the all-island economy. And today we want to focus at this conference on how we can capture the opportunities to renew and rebuild our economy for the benefit of all of the people of this island. And in this session we have four speakers. The first speaker is Sir George Quigley. After a career in the civil service, he became chairman of the Ulster Bank, and George has held many roles and has been pivotal to the direction of economic policy in the north of Ireland. We have Alastair Hamilton, who is the Chief Executive of Invest Northern Ireland, and I suppose is charged with the whole area of inward investment. And I know he and I have a varied correspondences and discussions about that particular issue. And all I would say is there needs to be a balanced distribution of those resources right across the north of Ireland. We have Dan O'Brien, who is the economics editor of the Irish Times, and it's important that Dan is here because he will bring to us a southern perspective on how to go about renewing and rebuilding the economy and how we do that on an all-island basis. Because lest we be in any doubt, what happens in the south, what happens in the Eurozone has a direct impact and implications for us in the north. And finally, we have Joe O'Reilly, who's Fine Gael TD for Cavan, Monaghan, who was a councillor for many years, and then was elected as TD for Cavan, Monaghan for Fine Gael back in the general election of 2011. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to ask Sir George to address us on the issues of, I suppose, job creation, and also, no doubt, he will be looking at our economic levers and what we need to do financially and economically to uplift and renew our economy. Sir George.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. When so much of the public space is preoccupied with considering how we deal with the past, it's refreshing to participate in a conference designed, as Dr. MacDonald's bidding letter put it, to highlight areas of hope for a future generation. Seamus Heaney once wrote with his usual insight that the inheritance of a divided society is a disabling one that traps its inhabitants and corners them in determined positions, sapping their will to act freely and creatively. I've long believed that the way to transcend inheritance and dissolve division is to focus forward, taking each other as we are, warts and all, and to become immersed in the shared task of creating a very different future. Economic performance and opportunity are key dimensions of that future. The outsiders in marginalised communities, the vulnerable, those experiencing joblessness and poverty and other forms of deprivation and exclusion, all these want to see the areas of hope identified and captured. So I'm delighted and honoured to contribute to your conference. Research has demonstrated that when an economic and a financial crisis both occur and reinforce each other, it takes far longer for economic growth and jobs to recover and for the housing market to revive. Mortgage finance, for example, soared by 150%. Public spending in real terms went up by an astronomical 53%, 4% a year. Health by 89%, education by 60%, welfare by 45%. On the other hand, it's been calculated that productivity in the public sector may have dropped by as much as 20% overall. It's useful to look at the pattern of job loss in Northern Ireland during the crisis. Employee jobs in the public sector kept on expanding until September 2009. Since when there's been a job loss of 10,000. The private sector peaked 18 months earlier, since when 36,000 jobs have gone. Construction's been particularly hard hit with a loss of 15,000 or 33.33% from peak. So we have been deflating from an abnormal credit-fueled high. Despite that, our unemployment rate is 6.7%, 0.5 percentage points down on a year ago, 1.5% below the UK rate.
Thank you very much, Sir George. Now I would like to ask Alastair Hamilton, Chief Executive of Invest Northern Ireland, to address us.
So I'm going to very quickly take a run through. The agenda has been very clearly set around recovery and renewal. I'll talk a little bit about on access to skills, and I hear the comments rightly that have been made both in terms of the current environment, but also looking forward into hopefully a future environment where corporation tax is devolved in Northern Ireland. We get that other arrow on our quiver, as Sir George says. This is the vital area for me. As I go overseas and my team go overseas to sell Northern Ireland, we sell people. That is the pitch. There's all those other things come along in terms of our lower cost of accommodation and our great infrastructure, whether it's telecoms or whatever else it may be. Those are all things we pitch. But the one thing we sell is we sell people. And therefore, in terms of the work that we've been doing, and I highlight the Assured Skills Programme, which is a very innovative model that was built between ourselves and the Department of Employment and Learning, whereby we now, and this is only running for about a year, whereby we now will give a contractual commitment to an inward investor, backed by both the colleges and the universities, to provide them with the people at the point they need them. So an inward investor will talk to us and say, I will create 200 jobs over a period of 5 years. Here's the skill sets they need broken down by year. And we will go back to the colleges and universities, work with them, and then give a contractual commitment tied into our letter of offer that we will provide the volume of people at interview. And that rightly then puts the onus back in the place that actually can properly deliver, which is in the universities and colleges and the wider employment service. So that's been a very, very successful scheme, and I'd like to see more of those where we're taking responsibility for the delivery of that skills pipeline. Our key focus for inward investment has been threefold: financial services, business services, and the important area of ICT and creative. The renewables area, which I know that one that the SDLP as a party has campaigned very strongly on over the last number of years, is one that we're now starting to see traction with and will be added to that list. I think the important piece from our point of view, and I know there have been some comments recently about how we support regional business, and I know there have been a lot of angst around the challenges of the Startup Business Programme as we get mired in some legal issues. Delighted to say that we're now out of that. A new tender will be launched very shortly. It'll be run in 5 regions, as you can see in this map. We're going to break it into those 5 regions. Those 5 regions are now co-aligned with the 11 council model. And again, we are making preparation for the implementation of RPA and the knowledge transfer that's required to get our knowledge into the councils to be able to support that.
Thank you, Alastair. Now I would like to move on to our next speaker. But before I do, I would like to acknowledge the presence and welcome to Fergus O'Dowd TD, who is Minister of State of the Department of Communications, Energy and Natural Resources. You're very welcome, Fergus. And we will have a political perspective later on in the morning from your colleague. Now I would like to move on to Dan O'Brien, who is Economics Editor with the Irish Times. Before joining the Irish Times in June 2010, Dan was a Senior Economist and Editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit, an arm of the Economist newspaper group. And he has worked in various countries throughout the world, and has also reported for CNN and the BBC, and in print for newspapers such as the International Herald Tribune and the Financial Times. And no doubt, having that background, Dan, you will be bringing not only a perspective from the South, but also an international perspective. You're very welcome.
Coming back to that issue of creativity and adaptability, those are the things that will always see us through in the end, and the capacity for people to generate new ideas and wealth very much involves the lowering of barriers and allowing people to do that. A positive, I think, is that the barrier that exists on this island for economic interaction, the border, still is something that if the barrier that it creates for commercial interaction can be lowered, then there is a real potential for the release of pent-up economic growth, not only in this region, but for the island as a whole, and that is a source of potential growth and a positive. That said, and I know Alastair alluded to it in his opening introduction, that talking about the, let's say, the crisis, the negative side of things can lead to despondency. I'm very conscious of that, and while I in no way want to engender despondency, I do think it's very important that we focus on the challenges, because I think there are some very big challenges coming down the line, and to be conscious and think about those challenges can at times mitigate their more negative impacts. Two of the challenges, and just this morning, both listening to the radio and reading the newspapers, encapsulated the two things that I'd like to highlight. First, the Cabinet Secretary in London spoke about the potential for 10 years of budgetary consolidation, budget cuts. This issue of rebalancing public finances is something that's not going to go away. And the other, affiliation, bringing public debt down and managing the euro crisis, are the two challenges I'd like to discuss over the course of the next few minutes. The role of the state, particularly in this part of the world, plays a very big part in the economy, but it plays a very big part in every modern developed economy, and that's how people want it. Voters want the state to provide services and to do a lot of things. The state is historically large, and it does a lot of positive things, and the old argument about state versus market, I think, is largely gone. People accept that there is a role for efficient markets and efficient government, and the two together can actually be mutually reinforcing rather than be working against each other. So I think the state is here to stay, and the idea that we won't have a welfare state in the future, or we'll have a much reduced state, I don't think that'll be the case. But because of what's happened to the public finances across the developed world over the past 4 years, it seems that there will be a long period of fiscal consolidation, and that is going to make things difficult and give at least the feeling that the state is being scaled back and not there to be as supportive in a whole range of ways as it has been in recent decades. In the integration process, since that process began more than half a century ago, that in itself is a very significant development, but it does increasingly appear that Britain will not be part of that development. From a Dublin perspective, it has always been the question that nobody wanted to have to answer, Britain or Europe, and it looks as though that question may have to be answered. If we go ahead with a much deeper integration, Britain has a referendum. It seems difficult to see how a referendum on not only staying in the EU as it exists now, but signing up to much deeper integration, that it's difficult to see how a referendum of that kind could be passed in Britain.
I would now like to move to our final speaker, Joe Riley, who is TD for Cavan, Monaghan, and who was a previous member of Shanadaran. Currently, he is the Vice Chair of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on the Good Friday Agreement, of which Alastair, Mark and I have observed ourselves.
Thank you, Chair Margaret Ritchie, MP, to acknowledge the very distinguished audience, elected reps and otherwise, but to just very quickly especially acknowledge your party leader, Dr. Alastair MacDonald. It's a very important conference today, and I know that your leader very correctly raised the bar and raised a challenge to you when he addressed earlier, when he spoke to you earlier. It's not enough that we cite achievements today and establish that we have cooperation. Of course we have, but the problem is that we don't have enough, that we haven't given it enough practical expression yet, and that it's not built on enough, and that we haven't realised its potential to improve our economies north and south. So I would commend education for consideration. Now, it has been cited at the outset by Dr. Alastair and picked up on by a number of the previous speakers that the agri-industry, agri-food, has huge potential for cooperation. And I know that you are in the 2020 harvest proposals in the south to reach production levels, much increased production levels, are being mirrored by the development of similar proposals in the north. Now, I think there's enormous potential for innovation and research, R&D in the agri-food sector on a north-south basis. I think there's enormous potential for processing, for investment on a north-south basis. I think that in the entire agri-food area we can cooperate and we should cooperate. And I think we have a similar type of green, almost organic farming north and south. And I think it's bizarre if we don't up the ante here and up the cooperation here and give practical expression to that. And I would suggest that that's another challenge that this conference needs to tease out, and that your party in going forward from today, obviously today is to germinate a whole concept and a whole policy. Well, from today I would humbly suggest to you that you would look to the agri-food sector, as indeed your leader suggested at the outset, but that you would look to it as an area with enormous potential. I might mention before I go into an area that's important and very much central to the agenda of and the executive responsibility of our Minister O'Dowd here, before I go into that critical area of broadband and make a reference to that, I want to just make a reference to a low level of cooperation that I think would be hugely beneficial. I think the road services, north and south, should come together to look at the link roads. The roads, just apart from the A5, the flagship project, which we support and is hugely important, and will be massive for linking north and south. And the A5 is a critical piece of infrastructure. But apart from that, there could be cooperation on the roads that connect the small towns on both sides of the border, on the other side. The cross-border roads are of an inferior quality, and the east-west link there is of an inferior quality. So I would challenge or suggest that it's a challenge to the local authorities in the border counties in the Republic and the road service, I think you describe it, you call it here, the road service here, to work together on that, in that practical area. And one other practical area, before I go back to the more macro stuff, is that would lend itself to practical cooperation, would have an economic output, but certainly would have a social output and a quality of life issue, is a cooperation in areas like doctor on call, cooperation in pooling the ambulance, having ambulance services working north-south, and the fire services. There's a lot of work. Some is happening. I don't think anyone affected by a fire, affected by sudden illness, by an accident on either side of the border is particularly concerned with ideology or politics at that juncture. And I think there's huge potential for cooperation there, because it's the low-level cooperation like that, for want of a better term, that I think you build from. You don't start from the top down, you work from the bottom up approach. Now, to make reference to broadband technology, and before I do that, I acknowledge the work on Project Cavan and its enormous implications and its success, and I think that's a hugely successful initiative, and I commend that. But there is a deficiency of broadband, and only on the way up the road this morning, because my hands free in the car is not working, I had to pull in to take a call from a person in Cavan, Monaghan, who's affected by the absence of broadband. There is still a huge deficiency of broadband, a huge deficiency of broadband in the rural communities, north and south of the border. And I think in broadband delivery, in the delivery of the infrastructure for broadband, there's a potential to cooperate. And I think we should be unhappy with what's not achieved in the area of cooperation. We should be unhappy that we haven't yet achieved enough in tourism, in broadband, right in the cultural sphere, and in all of the other areas I addressed. There's a great challenge out there yet for cooperation, and the challenge that I would put in front indeed of my own colleague, Minister O'Dowd, and your own executive here, is that they up the activity at this level, and that we challenge as political leaders in both communities for an upping of that activity. I think the potential is not yet remotely realised of what can be achieved in this area. I do think, and the very, very last word I would say, is that I do think the point is very well made and will have implications, enormous implications, positive implications for my constituency and for all of your areas, if we do get
a unified national corporation tax rate. I personally believe that will have great implications, because one of the difficulties, I'm going to finish at this, is that we're not attracting investment out of Dublin, out of Galway, out of Cork and these areas. And I think a unified corporation tax rate would help to attract investment in the regions and up in this area as well. I'll leave it at that. I think we need to address the challenges over the coming days and into the future. And it's certainly a great pleasure to address you. And I think at this stage, the coffee is on. Thank you.